Who's ready for the five for today, Monday, December 21st, as we are creeping ever so close to an actual civil war? We've seen threats of civil war over and over again from 1819 all the way to where we are right now in the 1850s. I think most of you are aware the Civil War will start in earnest in 1861, so we're getting pretty close. So we need to see this tension build up. We've mentioned also that Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun had worked hard for 40 years to sort of prevent this great catastrophe of disunion from ever happening. But after the death of all three of them between 1850 and 1852, people had to wonder who was going to rescue the Union if it threatened to tear apart again. Contribute to that in 1852, the publishing of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and the anger that has started to build over the fugitive slave law. And we're going to see a crisis situation starting to rise up in the United States. So let's jump into the five. We'll start with the growth of sectional tension as a result of two books that are going to be published during this time. Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and Hinton Helper's Impending Crisis in the South. We'll start with the work of fiction, which is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Harriet Beecher Stowe was the daughter of a Second Great Awakening preacher who was instrumental in working in the Underground Railroad and leading that revivalist, abolitionist momentum in Ohio. She writes a story, fictional story, a made-up family torn apart by slavery that shows horrible evil and abuse by the slave owner. This book is going to become immensely popular. It's going to sell millions of copies, not only across the U.S., but in Europe as well. It starts to be performed as a play, printed in newspapers. This thing goes as viral again as you can in the 1850s. It becomes something that, for example, John Brown, who you read about in this section, he would read it to his children every night at dinner, another chapter, and then just start it over to just get ingrained in their heads the evils of slavery and the fact that they will never, ever participate in the fugitive slave laws enforcements. The South is going to be overwhelmingly angry over Uncle Tom's Cabin because how could a Northern woman write an accurate depiction of slavery in the South? It's fiction. It's a made-up story. Why are people getting so emotional about it? But that emotion and the attachment of, let's say, moral high ground to the position of abolition is going to grow in the North. Now, Hinton Helper's book isn't going to be nearly as popular, but it is an interesting one because Helper is actually from the South, and he is going to write a nonfiction approach using statistics to demonstrate to his target audience, which is poor whites, non-slaveholding whites in the South, that they need to stop supporting slavery and the Southern way of life. Helper is going to imply that poor Southerners support slavery because it means there's someone below them. But he is going to try to argue with statistics that those people that are below them are the reason why they can't get ahead too, that economically slavery is a disaster for non-slaveholding families in the South. Now, it's not going to reach its target audience. There's going to be a bunch of poor Southern whites that are going to read this scientific statistical analysis, but it actually is going to be embraced and used by the Republican Party as a demonstration of why slavery needs to be defeated in the South. In the South, how do they deal with Hinton Helper's book? Well, they have mass book burnings where they destroy copies of it. All right, now we're going to move all our attention to Kansas. So 1854's Kansas-Nebraska Act, right? It takes the Nebraska territory, an unorganized territory, and it's going to turn it into two organized territories, Kansas and Nebraska, each that will elect its own territorial government and create a proposal for a state constitution once it has 60,000 settlers. The true idea of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was twofold. It was supposed to open up a possible route of a transcontinental railroad through Nebraska. And it was also supposed to allow the prospect of slavery to spread not to Nebraska, but to Kansas. That was kind of the understood piece of it. Now, the problem was most of the people moving to Kansas aren't slave owners because Kansas's land wasn't really going to be used for that kind of plantation raising. So most of the people moving into Kansas were actually poor farmers, most of them from the north. But there were about 2,000 abolitionist families that are going to move in and settle in the town of Lawrence and build an anti-slavery abolitionist settlement. The reason these families moved in is because they wanted to participate in the popular sovereignty election that would choose the government for Kansas, because they wanted Kansas to eventually apply for statehood as a free state. And there will be Southern anger over this as well. Southerners, especially congressmen, were angry because of that intention that the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a compromise meant for Kansas to become pro-slavery. But that's not what happened. So pro-slavery extremists started to arrive next in Kansas, supported by border ruffians, angry pro-slavery settlers from Missouri. Missouri at this time is a slave state, has been for several decades. And Missouri wants a pro-slavery next door neighbor and to keep that balance going in the Senate. So with that, settlers from pro-slavery Missouri will threaten violence on anti-slavery encampments and will vote, as your book says, early and often in the territorial elections. So somehow, even though almost all of Kansas' settlers are anti-slavery, even though there are hardly any slaves in Kansas at all at this point, in the election, they choose a pro-slavery territorial government. The anti-slavery settlement of Lawrence is going to hold a side election to choose their own government. So you end up having two rival territorial governments in one territory in Kansas. One of them elected by fraud and pro-slavery, the other illegally formed and no bearing for its existence, anti-slavery. This is going to result in an event called Bleeding Kansas. This is your prelude to a civil war. Over the course of about a year and a half, there's going to be 100 to 200 people killed in Kansas through some version of warfare, and millions of dollars of property are going to be destroyed. The two biggest events in the Bleeding Kansas incident are the sacking of Lawrence and the Potawatomi Massacre. So let's talk about each of those quickly. In the sacking of Lawrence, Lawrence was where the anti-slavery headquarters were for this illegal government, for two newspapers that were distributed around Kansas that promoted anti-slavery abolition, and the home of the kind of puppet governor of this illegally formed government. And about 1,100 men from Missouri are going to ride in, bearing torches and rifles, and they're going to burn down the printing presses of the newspaper, burn down the governor's home, and shoot their guns up and burn down the hotel and all kinds of things in Lawrence to destroy this anti-slavery settlement. When John Brown, an angry abolitionist from New York, then Ohio, when he comes down with several of his sons with a wagon load of rifles, he is going to tell the anti-slavery settlers of Lawrence, you can't just sit back and let them do this. We need to retaliate. We need to meet violence with violence. And so John Brown is going to be a bit of a trigger for the Civil War, and you'll see his name pop up a few times because he's going to do a couple things that are really going to urge the more peaceful anti-slavery side, which I think that should be obvious that they would be more peaceful, but he is going to urge them that the only way we can get rid of slavery is by spilling a whole lot of blood. The Potawatomi Massacre is kind of where he rises in fame. He, his sons, and scores of others from Lawrence are going to ride into a pro-slavery encampment near the Kansas-Missouri border, where they're going to find 5 pro-slavery families camped out. They're going to murder the men by cutting them to pieces with sabers. So Potawatomi Massacre becomes kind of famous, and John Brown becomes a wanted man, where he's going to go into hiding and then pop out and do some violence, then go into hiding and then pop out and try something different. So we'll see him continue to show up as we build towards, the culminating event of all this, which is the Civil War. So in the meantime, though, Kansas is going to apply for statehood. 60,000 settlers eventually are in the Kansas Organized Territory in 1857. And it's the job of their territorial government to write a state constitution and apply for statehood. Except you have the fraudulent government and the illegal government. What's the fraudulent government that is going to stage another fraudulent election, a corrupt vote that says the people, through popular sovereignty, picked this constitution? We call it the Lecompton Constitution. It is not going to become law. It is not going to become the government of Kansas. Congress is not going to approve it. But the Lecompton Constitution is important for the effect it has on the nation. When this pro-slavery fraudulent government submits this fraudulent constitution to the U.S. government for Kansas statehood as a slave state, they believe, this fraudulent government and Southern Democrats believe, it's going to pass. That was the intent of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas comes in as a slave state. But the Democrats split on it. Well, President Buchanan, newly elected Democrat, is going to support the Lecompton Constitution, and so are Southern Democrats. Republicans, of course, will oppose it, but Northern Democrats start to oppose it too. Led by Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas, who was the one who negotiated the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Douglas and Northern Democrats are going to insist this isn't popular sovereignty. The idea is that the people who moved there get to decide, not people in neighboring Missouri, not a fraudulent government that doesn't even allow people to vote. We need to send the Lecompton Constitution back to Kansas, and we need to make sure that they have a legitimate election by the people who live there to say, is this the Constitution you want? A pro-slavery Constitution. When it goes back to Kansas, there is a legitimate revote on the Lecompton Constitution, and it fails. The Lecompton Constitution does not pass. So Kansas revokes its application for statehood and will not apply for statehood again for several years. Instead, Kansas just remains a territory until 1861. And the violence that we saw in Kansas is going to spread to Congress. Congressman Preston Brooks, a Democrat from South Carolina, is going to go into the Senate and find Republican Senator Charles Sumner, who had given a pretty volatile speech that was attacking Southern congressmen and senators, including Brooks' uncle, Senator Andrew Butler of South Carolina, and really going after the Kansas-Nebraska Act as what will eventually destroy the nation. Brooks beats Sumner unconscious. And what this means, it's not that this incident is so important, but it's the symbolism of the incident that historians have started to say, this is the marker, right? This is a point where we're starting to see that things go in a wholly different direction. Gone is Henry Clay, the great compromiser. Gone is the spirit of unionism, that Whig National Party that said, hey, we don't even want to talk about slavery. We just want to talk about keeping the Union together. Gone are national political parties completely, as we see the Democrats split apart on the Kansas Constitution. So what is going to happen? Suddenly everything is North versus South. Suddenly everything is violence instead of compromise. It's emotion instead of reason. This is getting intense, and disaster awaits us. Now, attached to this video is an article about the Brooks and Sumner affair. Check it out if you're a little bit more interested in this violent encounter and what happens to each of the men. You can read about that there. And keep reading tonight. Tomorrow, we'll visit another 5 where we'll talk about what happens next. The Supreme Court, for example, is going to weigh in on all this, and things are going to get a little bit more intense as we creep closer to 1861. Have a good day.